In the fast-paced world of business, finding a clear path to profitability can be a challenge. Welcome to 0 to 100 with your host, Jared Guy Randolph, seasoned business and finance expert. Tune in for actionable insights and strategies to accelerate your business success.
Hello, Accelerators. Today on 0 to 100, I am very excited to welcome John Park. He is a compliance and regulation expert in retirement planning. Been in the business for 35 years. Prior to that, he was the compliance administrator for the Big Ten Conference. He also was the assistant athletic director at Arizona State University. Cool guy, cool background, great information that he's going to give us today. He is the president of PGI Self-Directed. They work directly with business owners and entrepreneurs just like you to help them set up their self-directed IRAs and 401ks. Today, we're going to have a singular focus on setting up that self-directed IRA, rules and regulations, how you do it, cash flow, and also, most importantly, checkbook control to make sure that you are guiding where those investments go. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Jared Guy Randolph. I am the founder of BoxFi. We are a business growth solution through payment processing, and I'm excited to share my network I've built over my 25-year entrepreneurial journey to help you grow your business and become more profitable. Ladies and gentlemen, let's accelerate together. John Park, welcome to 0 to 100. We're very happy to have you today.
Likewise. Nice to be here with you, Jared.
So we're going to have a very interesting conversation about the mythical world of 401ks, IRAs, managing your checkbook, and setting yourself up for success for the long run as an entrepreneur. I want to dive in with something that it actually was probably not until the last 3 or 4 years that I knew anything about, and that was the difference between a self-directed IRA and a traditional IRA. Can you give our audience of entrepreneurs some insight on how each one of them works?
Got it. I'm going to start off a little bit differently than what I might normally say, and that is that the IRS doesn't draw any distinction between, in effect, a traditional IRA and a self-directed IRA. It's the industry that kind of separates the difference, but there is a difference. Okay. So what I mean by that is the IRS doesn't sit there and say that you can only invest in these things that Charles Schwab sells. And I'm picking on Chuck there, but they don't tell you that you have to do securities. You are basically able to do a wide range of investments. Now, the problem is when you have your IRA at, Fidelity, Schwab, et cetera, any of the big boys, there's no selfish interest on their part to allow somebody to invest non-traditionally, meaning things outside of the market. So the things I'm talking about is if somebody wanted to buy a rental property to rent out of their retirement plan. The IRS doesn't stipulate. There's rules, of course, that the IRS requires you to follow, but that's not an impermissible asset. If somebody wanted to do a private money lending situation to another third party, the IRS doesn't say that that's impermissible. You can't do that with your IRA at Charles Schwab or Fidelity, either of those two. But the reason I say the IRS doesn't differentiate because they have what's called IRA law. And under the IRA law, an IRA has to be held through a custodian. Same if it's a self-directed IRA. The self-direction is just showing that the person has the ability to direct those investments versus being only given a certain menu of a certain allowable choice of menu items to choose from.
Interesting. So let's talk about setting up that self-directed IRA. And if someone were to set up an IRA with a professional like you, what are the steps? We always want our audience to be informed and prepared when they're making these decisions or they're going to get more information. How would they go about it?
Yep. So if they were reaching out to PGI, I would have an initial phone call with them to explain the process. Part of my personality is I don't necessarily like to just send them, a massive group of emails. I like to actually talk to somebody, kind of explain how the structure is set up. I think what your listeners should also know, Jared, is what PGI sets up is a checkbook control model, and there's some great benefits associated with that. They typically are going to save money in fees. They're going to not have the frustration of dealing with the custodian, because what I want your listeners to know is when they establish a self-directed IRA with a custodian that does not permit checkbook control, they're going to end up having frustrations with that custodian because custodians might be really good at being a custodian for their IRA account and following IRS law of what needs to happen, but they're not necessarily a good processor of investment paperwork. And sometimes people can get really frustrated with that. But to get back to your question is, if somebody is wanting that checkbook control for those reasons I mentioned, then we're creating, we have two different structures. We have an IRA LLC, we have an IRA trust, but it's initially I'd be having a phone call with one of these individuals, and they would indicate to me whether they're interested in looking at the LLC structure or the trust structure. And we would just have a conversation about IRS rules, how the flow gets started, et cetera. But I always like to have that initial lead-in conversation. And then from there, once we get some information on what they're wanting to do, we get various documents sent out for DocuSigns, et cetera. And then we'll set up that client with either that IRA LLC or that IRA trust. But both of those will provide that person checkbook control of those funds.
So if you have a self-directed IRA versus a traditional IRA, you talked about fees. Is there a difference or a standard in each one for the fees that you can expect to pay?
Definitely a variety of what various companies in this space charge, for sure. But as far as why there's a fee, because it would be very normal for one of your listeners to go, well, I have an IRA at Fidelity right now, and they're not, charging me a fee. Why would a self-directed IRA be charging a fee structure? Well, two reasons. One is self-directed custodians do not sell securities. They are only there to fulfill the IRS's requirement that the IRA be held legally through an IRS-approved custodian, but they're not there to sell you stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. So explanation number one is a custodian still has to make their money. They have employees, they have a building, and all that other good stuff. So they have an annual fee. With the checkbook control structure, the custodians only charge an annual fee, and that's to serve as the custodian. Then on my side, with my company, PGI Self-Directed, then we have a fee to set up the structure, whether it's the LLC or the trust, so that I'll use you as the example, Jared. If you were creating an IRA LLC structure for yourself where you control the checkbook, PGI is actually structuring the documents so that you can legally invest those monies as the manager of the LLC. And then your IRA will be the member of that LLC. But the main visual for right now is we're creating the structure so that you can legally do it, but we're not involved with selling you investments, making money off your investments. That's totally whatever you choose to do.
And with that particular structure, how much can you put into that IRA on an annual basis?
Okay, here's where some people get confused, and the IRS doesn't help with the confusion, I guess. Most people will initially fund their self-directed IRA with what the IRS still calls a contribution, but it's really not a contribution in the sense of how we visualize a contribution. So let's say I'm going to use you. I like to use visuals, Jared. So let's use you again. You call me up and you go, hey, I want to set up this IRA LLC. And I've understood that there's some limitations on how much I can put in.
Right.
And I say, well, yeah, as far as new contributions, if you're under the age of 50, which you are, $7,000 for 2024. If you're over the age of 50, $8,000. Right. Now Jared says, oh, I got $300,000 that I wanted to transfer over into this self-directed IRA. Are you telling me I can't do it because that's well past either the $7,000 or the $8,000? Right. No, those are rollovers or transfers coming from other retirement plans. So even though the IRS calls everything a contribution, there is a difference between rolling over or transferring funds from another plan into your self-directed IRA on a non-taxable basis versus putting in a new contribution of either $7,000 or $8,000 into your IRA moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I want to make sure that the audience understands this very clearly, is that if you want to move your IRA into a self-directed IRA, it is still a contribution, but what it's considered is a rollover or a transfer of funds. So you can do that in a tax-free manner versus it being considered a new contribution, which is limited to up to $7,000 for anyone under 50, anyone over 50, up to $8,000.
Yep, you got that exactly right. And I always use the visual when I talk to people is I will say, Warren Buffett can have his own self-directed IRA if he really wants to. He can roll over $10 million from another retirement plan that he's got monies into. That has nothing to do with the $7,000 or $8,000 contribution limit.
Very interesting. And maybe I should actually get to this first. Let's talk about the types of investments that you can make with a self-directed IRA that you can't with a traditional IRA. And then when you receive profits from that investment, how they go back into the IRA.
Yep. So let's talk. The asset one is really easy. The IRS, as far as there's other rules that come into play, but the only assets that the IRS specifically says that an IRA cannot invest into are life insurance contracts and collectibles. So if Jared called me one day, here's a joke I kind of use with people, and I've never been known for being funny, by the way, so it's not really a joke. But I'll tell somebody, you could call me for 5 straight days, and you might say, can I do cryptocurrency? Yeah, it's a permissible asset. Can I buy a rental property? Yeah. Can I do a real estate syndication? Yeah. Can I be involved in commercial real estate? Yeah. Can I do private money lending? Probably about the 4th or 5th day, Jared, of you calling me, I'm going to say, hey, Jared, I like you. You're a nice young man. But bottom line is, if it's not a life insurance contract, if it's not a collectible, asset-wise, you're fine. Now, how does that compare to Charles Schwab? Well, that's obvious to everybody. If you go to Charles Schwab and say, hey, take $300,000 out of my retirement account, I want to go buy this rental property. Chuck's going to say, hey, we can send you the $300,000, but you're going to be taxed and penalized on taking that money out because we don't sell rental homes here at Charles Schwab. But the IRS does not say that that's an impermissible asset, but Charles Schwab and any company like Schwab has every legal right to be able to say, this is a Charles Schwab IRA, and we will only allow you to invest in securities that we sell. Doesn't mean that the IRS says they can't do other types of investments. Is what Charles Schwab is dictating those rules because it's their IRA.
Got you. So we talked about what you can put into it, the self-directed versus the traditional. We also touched on the management of the money and the contribution that you can potentially do a rollover or a transfer without tax consequence. Let's talk about when you're making an investment out of that IRA. Let's call it, because you like examples, into a real estate syndication. You invest $200,000 into a real estate syndication, and in 3 years it returns your $200,000 plus an additional $200,000. How is that treated?
Yeah. So first of all, it would be a non-taxable. Well, I shouldn't say non-taxable. There are ways that an IRA can be taxed. And there is a tax code. I don't know that we want to get into a deep dive right now with it, but there is a tax code. Yeah, there is a tax code just so people can at least hear the terminology called UDFI, which stands for unrelated debt financed income. That could be applicable to doing a real estate syndication from their IRA. But let's just kind of go past that issue for right now. With real estate syndication, we're going to be creating that IRA LLC structure. So if we're doing that for Jared will eventually, those monies are going to come from wherever his funds initially were to the new self-directed custodian into that LLC structure that we're setting up. Jared's going to be the manager of that, so he controls the day-to-day business activities. His IRA is the member or the owner of that LLC. So now Jared goes and says, well, I want to do this real estate syndication and I'm going to put a couple $100,000 into it. Calls me up and says, John, do I have to call you for this? I'm going to say no. Do I have to call the custodian to report this? I'm going to say no. Those IRA funds are now the legal owner of that LLC. That LLC goes out and does the real estate syndication. Any subscription agreement will be titled in the name of the LLC, never the person's IRA. It's going to be at the LLC because, again, it is owned by the IRA. Now the titling is in the LLC. Investment returns come back to the LLC. Rinse and repeat as often as you wish. Now, just to put a follow-up onto that, let's just say Jared did self-direction for 5 years. He made a killing, but he was just done. He just said, hey, it's been a good ride. I'm done. I want to move these monies back to like a Charles Schwab. Okay, not a problem. Those monies would go from the LLC bank account, again, owned by the IRA, into his IRA account with the self-directed custodian. That cash could then be transferred back over to an IRA at Charles Schwab in a non-taxable manner. So there's always going to be an exit strategy for people who eventually want an exit strategy. But otherwise, you can pretty much use that IRA LLC structure for any investment that you're doing. And the only other caveat I bring up is the only time I would suggest that somebody strongly consider having more than one IRA LLC structure would be as if they were going to go out and buy 3 rental properties, all from the same IRA account. It'd probably be good across the board, and I'm sure an attorney would agree as well, that each one of those LLCs, we would create 3 LLCs, each owned by the IRA, but each of those LLCs would separately go out and buy its own property.
And that is for liability reasons?
Liability reasons, bookkeeping reasons, the list goes on and on. So it's because you need to have the LLC for the checkbook control anyway. The side benefit, so to speak, of that structure is it is a limited liability company, which is going to provide some liability protection to the individual.
Excellent. So we touched on a lot of the parameters around structuring it. Are there any other key rules and regulations that you need to look at with the self-directed IRAs?
Yeah, we'd probably go in more detail, but let me identify the primary things that people want to stay away from. Okay. First one we talked about was disqualified assets. It's pretty straightforward. The IRS doesn't restrict you from too many things asset-wise. Mm-hmm. Then there's a rule called disqualified individuals. Disqualified individuals, I always get the visual of a cross or a horizontal and vertical plane crossing each other. That individual IRA account owner on the vertical plane, that individual IRA account owner, their spouse, if there is one, children below them as bloodline descendants, if there are children, mm-hmm. and any parents or grandparents to the IRA account owner and their spouse who are bloodline ascendants mm-hmm. are all considered disqualified individuals to the plan. So what that means in just simple language is the IRS would say under self-dealing rules, none of those individuals can receive a transactional benefit associated with that investment, nor can they provide a transactional benefit. So I rarely get this question, but if somebody said, well, wait, John, if I'm good at investing, my IRA is going to grow and I'm benefiting from that. So you're not even making sense with what you're saying. And I'm going to say, well, everybody obviously understands that, including the IRS. Mm-hmm. What they're basically saying is, let's use you as the example, Jared. Mm-hmm. If you're a realtor and you go out and use your IRA LLC funds to buy a rental property mm-hmm. and you get a commission, mm-hmm. I can almost guarantee you your broker's not going to know these rules and they're going to issue you a commission check.
Right.
But if you ask me, is that permissible? I'd say no, because you're a disqualified person to your own IRA and you cannot materially benefit from that investment.
So if you have a self-directed IRA, you cannot materially benefit from investing in a property or investing in a property that or a project that a family member is running because the IRS does not allow that.
Correct. Yes. And every situation can have its potential exceptions depending on how something might be structured. But as a general rule that I would want your listeners to know is any of those people I just mentioned as disqualified people, you just want to stay away from doing anything where they're either providing a benefit to your IRA or they're receiving a benefit, including yourself, because it's probably going to be a prohibited transaction.
So could you invest in buy a 20-unit multifamily rental building and hire your son's business as the property manager?
I would not do that because...
Very interesting. Wow.
Because the son is a disqualified bloodline descendant.
Yeah. Those are the type of nuances that get you in trouble. And let's talk about if you were to do that, if the IRS found out, what are the consequences of something like that?
Well, with an IRA, they're pretty severe. It's what's considered full distribution, and here's the example I always give people is let's say Jared had $1 million IRA, but he did a transaction that was just $2,000, mm-hmm. thought it was fine, probably is never going to be audited, but let's just say you're audited and the IRS comes up with this $2,000 expense and they're asking you to explain it. And you explain it. You don't think you're doing anything wrong, but they don't agree with you. And let's just say they're right, because you can always appeal it and go to tax court, but usually they're right about what they're saying. Mm-hmm. So now Jared kind of like pulls out his wallet, so to speak, like, well, hey, gee, like, what do I owe, like tax or penalty? And can I just get this taken care of? And basically what they're going to hear is, oh, you don't have to worry about that. Your IRA has been distributed. And what that means in IRS language is that full $1 million has now been considered taxable. If you're under the age of 59 and a half, you also have penalties. And bottom line is you lose your IRA. So for a $2,000 transaction, if you're not doing something correctly, it could potentially totally disqualify your IRA account. Now, yes, whatever, after you pay the tax and the penalties, whatever you get is your money. Mm-hmm. But most people don't want it coming out of the IRA account anyway, let alone having those taxes and penalties by dealing with a prohibited transaction. So just so you know how I deal with my clients is PGI is not the tax firm, not the law firm. We're setting up the structure. But I always tell people I've been in the business for a long time. I do encourage people to visit with me about their transactions. But I will also heavily emphasize to them that before they cut that check or do that wire transfer, it's probably incumbent upon them to review with their tax or legal professional just to make sure they're not violating an IRS prohibited transaction.
So let's use the example of $1 million that you have in your IRA, and you decide to go out and you need $200,000. Let's not be concerned about what you need it for, but you need $200,000. What is the tax consequence of taking out that $200,000 as a 50-year-old individual?
Well, as a 50-year-old individual, you're still going to have to pay the taxes associated, unless it's a hardship. Now, there's qualifying hardships where somebody can take money out. It's like when you say the person just takes the money out because they need it. Well, it depends on what they need it for. If they have a child going to college with tuition, there's exceptions to the normal rules. But if you're just taking the money out because you want to go to Las Vegas and play that one-handed blackjack, and you're 50 years old, you're going to be paying taxes. You're going to have a 10% penalty on top of that. It's just probably something that you're not going to be interested in doing unless it was a true hardship. And then I would encourage somebody, well, let's see if you potentially qualify for an exception with the hardship provisions. But if there's no hardship provisions, it's tax and penalty.
So give me an example. You talked about potentially, and maybe this was just something you were throwing out there, tuition for a child to go to college. What are maybe 2 or 3 hardship provisions where you could potentially take cash out of that IRA?
Yeah, there's some exceptions for medical provisions, severe health issue kind of issues. I believe there's a provision for losing employment that you've had. College education is one. I'd have to go through the list to kind of see the whole list, but usually most people, fortunately, don't have to necessarily do that. But if they do, they always want to see if there's an exception versus just taking the tax hit and the penalty.
What about instead of taking out the $200,000 from the $1 million IRA, could you borrow against that if you were to go to a lender?
When you say go to a lender,
borrow against your IRA. Say you've got $1 million of value in your IRA. Can you borrow against it?
No, you cannot, because again, you're a disqualified person, so you cannot take a loan directly out of. Now, there's an exception when we talk about the solo K. You can take out a loan, what's called a participant loan from your solo K, and that's a permissible activity. But with an IRA, if you owe me one of the exceptions, you can't just borrow against it or pledge its assets on a loan, because in the eyes of the IRS, that money doesn't belong to you.
So one thing that's really important for the audience to listen to here and key in is, depending on the type of investment vehicle, it will only function in one way. If you have a regular investment account, you could potentially borrow against it. But if you have a self-directed IRA or an IRA, you cannot borrow against that IRA because it benefits you as the individual. Those are one of the key things to note when you're building your investment portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage your listeners just to realize one simple visual is, in the eyes of the IRS, everybody knows this is the money in the IRA is for your benefit in retirement years. But prior to that, it's legally owned by the IRA. Yes, it benefits you, but that's why they have these strict rules about you cannot conduct business with yourself, et cetera, or any other disqualified person, because legally speaking, those funds don't belong to you. You're just managing those investments.
So let's talk about getting up there in age. And because 0 to 100 is all about accelerating, and we like talking about big numbers, let's say you've got $10 million in your IRA and you're 65 years old, which is young, and you pass away. How is that IRA affected if it's in trust to your estate in terms of taxes?
That'll be all depending on how you just identify the beneficiaries. So I think I know the path you're going with the question. So let's say John's married to Patty, and John hits the bus, and John's just no longer with us, unfortunately. I would have already identified to the custodian who my intended beneficiaries are.
Okay.
And for a person who's married, but let's say also has a family living trust, most likely the spouse, because the spouse that dies would want the other spouse to be able to live and buy groceries and those kind of things. Right. So the spouse would be identified as the primary beneficiary in almost all cases. And then the family living trust would be identified as the secondary. So if it was a situation where both people died, let's say simultaneously, then those assets, instead of going to the spouse who's now dead, would go to the trust. And then the trust would distribute those assets based on the trustee's wishes.
And I know we're not getting too much into tax and policy, but it ultimately would be taxed based on estate transfer taxes, correct?
It could be taxed, but more likely than not, the beneficiary, let's say it was a child, could take it as a decedent IRA and then be on a schedule to still be able to use the money to invest, but they would also have to take out taxable distributions. So there's a couple options. It's not like they're, just because you're, let's say, the child and you get the benefits of the IRA, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to take them all at that time. You could actually move those funds that you got through death into your own inherited IRA.
Got you. So this is really important for the audience to listen to, is that there are so many different options that you have when you are looking to create an investment portfolio. Speaking to an expert is always key, and having a team of experts so you're putting together something that is going to be most effective for you and your family in the situation that you're in, because this genuinely is not one size fits all. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, John, it's still in the IRA before we jump to a couple other topics, which will be fun for us to talk about today, is the taxation and the UBIT, the UBIT. Talk to us a little bit more about how they are taxed.
Okay. So UBIT and a subsection of UBIT called UDFI, with your permission, I'm going to do it at a 50,000 foot view level because it can be extremely difficult for people to kind of grasp onto it just over a video. But yes, there are two ways that an IRA can be taxed. UBIT stands for unrelated business income tax. It's basically a scenario where, and this applies to a 401k as well, UBIT does, but that's a scenario where the retirement plan is receiving active profits from a business investment. Mm-hmm. So an example I use, which would in almost all cases trigger UBIT, would be, let's say I own a McDonald's. I don't. Let's just say I did. And okay. Jared, my company never goes out and tries to solicit investments. Well, let's just say I did. So I reach out to Jared one day and I go, hey, Jared, I have this McDonald's. I need to do a facelift with it. I need $50,000. I don't want to necessarily get it from other sources, but Jared, I like you. And what I want to do is I want to borrow $50,000 from you, and I'm going to pay you 3% of the profits from my business over X period of time. Mm-hmm. And let's just say you decide to do that investment. Mm-hmm. That would not be illegal. But now your IRA or your 401k would be getting paid based on the business activities of that business. Mm-hmm. And there's very good reasons why this rule is in place, by the way. But now because of that, your IRA or your 401k would owe some money in taxes, because it wouldn't be fair for you to receive business income from profits and not have to pay taxes when other people who don't maybe use an IRA or a 401k would be having capital gains taxes associated with that investment. Rarely do people trigger UBIT, but it's always going to be a situation where their IRA or their 401k is invested into a business opportunity that pays them not interest, because that interest is passive, but actually pays them percentage of profits associated with that business activity. That's UBIT in a nutshell. UDFI, and your listeners need to know this, only applies to an IRA. It does not apply to a 401k. But what is it? It stands for unrelated debt financed income. So in short, if an IRA is in either taking on debt itself through like a mortgage on a leveraged property, which is potentially permissible to do, rules have to be followed, but it's potentially permissible to do, whether it's that situation or, like you mentioned earlier, a real estate syndication. Mm-hmm. Real estate syndications are very popular right now, but I don't know probably that there's a single syndicator in the United States of America that doesn't take on debt. So they may raise monies passively from people like you, me, et cetera, and they may go buy an asset. Let's say it's an apartment complex. Mm-hmm. If they're not taking any debt on that, there's no debt. But let's now say that syndicator goes out and spends $3 million in debt financing to rehabilitate the property. Well, that $3 million was generated through loan. So in fact, what the IRS is saying is the IRA cannot just benefit from investment returns that were generated with debt financing. So in that particular case, when they get a K-1, if it's anything more than $1,000 and there was debt financing, there will be a formula where their IRA would owe some tax. But it's actually a good rule because there have been abuses in the past. So nobody likes to pay taxes. Everybody understands that. But I always tell people when they're doing syndications, it's, well, first of all, you got to figure out with the syndicator if this UDFI tax will be applicable based on the debt financing. And then number two, you're probably getting a very healthy return where, okay, if you have to pay some tax, just pay the tax. It will be the IRA that will pay the tax. Right. Just pay it. get it over with, because your investment return would probably justify that expense anyway.
You're setting up your IRA. Who are the key players that you need to have on your team? And in particular, a self-directed IRA that can help you make sure that you're being compliant, you're following all the rules and regulations, and you don't run into major tax issues or consequences.
Yeah, I'm going to use the example of a self-directed IRA with the LLC checkbook control, because that's what we're kind of talking about. Okay. So you have to have a custodian. And so companies like PGI, my company, we have relationships with custodians. So it's not like the client has to find their own custodian. Mm-hmm. We have options for them on the custodian side, but you got to have that custodian in play. That's required. That's the law. If you're having a checkbook control, then you would be using the services of a PGI or an ABC or an XYZ to set up either that IRA LLC or the IRA trust structure, which will then permit the custodian to release funds to either that LLC or trust structure owned by the IRA. So then Jared can go out and make investments on behalf of either of those two plans. So you would have the custodian, you're going to have like a PGI, which I just call a facilitator company. And then honestly, that's getting it funded. That's getting the structure set up. But now you have a living vehicle of what you're trying to do. So I always tell people is you can always call John and ask questions, but to say that you don't need to make sure you have a close relationship with your CPA or your attorney would probably be pretty foolish for me to say. Now, realizing that a lot of times people don't want to pay the extra money to consult with a tax professional or an attorney, I get that. But at the end of the day, these are your retirement funds. So if there's any question about what you're doing and you want to make sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed from a tax standpoint, yeah, you should probably always visit with a tax or legal professional as well.
So audience, listen very clearly. There's 4 people that you need on your team if you're going to set up this self-directed IRA and do it right. You need your custodian, your facilitator, like a PGI. You're going to need your CPA and a good tax attorney. So just know that to do it right, these are your retirement funds. Don't play around with them. Make sure you have the right team in place. There is one other thing I want to touch on before we go into our rapid fire section, John. And that is, and you've brought it up, but I'd like for you to define it a little bit more, talk about the advantages as well as the risk of checkbook control. What does that mean? What are the advantages? What are the risks?
So whether you're doing a solo carry or a self-directed IRA LLC, in either of those structures, you're going to control the checkbook. So the obvious benefit is now someone says, oh, so I control that checkbook. I don't have to get anybody else's approval. Okay, John, yeah, I understand. I got to follow some IRS rules. Those are the obvious benefits. You save money in fees. You save with the frustration factor. A frustration factor meaning Jared has to do a timely investment and he doesn't have checkbook control. He reaches out to his custodian and he says, hey, I have this subscription agreement here. I got to fund it within 4 days. And they go, oh, this is going to take us 2 weeks. Well, that's frustrating for Jared now because he's like, wow, if I had the ability to control the checkbook, I could just write a check or do a wire transfer and be done in 15 minutes.
Yes.
Or he might have to wait 2 weeks with the custodian. The second part is fees. And this is fair for custodians that don't allow the checkbook control. If they're doing assignments for you and tasks for you, it's only natural that their fee structure is going to be higher. So what I will honestly tell people is if you went the route of not having a checkbook control, the first year you may save money by not having checkbook control. But starting in year 2, for sure by year 3, you're actually going to be saving money. The reason being is when you control the checkbook, the custodians charge lower fee structure because they're not doing the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's. Now, finally, what's one of the negatives? Is that when you control a checkbook, there are still IRS rules you have to follow. I mean, let's make no bones about it. They may not be overly complicated based on what the person is trying to do. Like if somebody says, can I buy a rental property? Yeah, you can buy a rental property. But depending on their strategy and how complicated they might be trying to do something, they always want to have that tax advice. And here's where sometimes people will say, but if I have a custodian structure only, no checkbook control, they're going to make sure I follow all IRS rules. And it's somewhat of a security blanket that's not always going to be there. And what I mean by that is,
Mm.
yes, the custodians are always going to try to do their very best to make when there's no checkbook control. They're going to make sure when they're reviewing that investment paperwork that it doesn't appear to be a prohibited transaction before they sign off on it, wire the funds out, etc. But sometimes people are lulled into the belief that just because they have a custodian supervising that it'll mean that they won't have any prohibited transactions. And I'm going to guarantee you what the custodians are going to say. We do not give tax or legal advice. We follow instructions. So on the one hand, a custodian will try to make sure they do their best. I want to give them the credit for that. But on the other hand, they would even be the first ones to say, if we make a mistake, we're not going to be liable for this because you told us and you directed us to make this investment on behalf of your IRA. So I just kind of tell people, if you feel like you're mature enough to control the checkbook and organized enough not to go buy groceries and pay the mortgage with your retirement funds, you might as well, the prohibited transactions are going to apply to you regardless of whether you're using a custodian or not.
Right. That makes sense. So, John, we're going to do something fun. You've given us a lot of information, great context. And the key with this and why it's an important topic is I've had this conversation with many of the business owners that we work with. I've looked at it for myself as well. You need to understand that there's a lot of nuance in setting up your IRA. Next time we'll have you on, John, we're going to talk about 401ks because there's nuance in that as well. The most important thing is you have a general knowledge of what it is, how to do it, and then you make sure you have the right people around you to execute on it.
Yep.
Let's do the rapid fire section. So,
Oh boy.
quick answers, off the cuff, coffee or tea?
Coffee.
If there is a zombie apocalypse and you have to leave your house and protect your family, what is your weapon of choice?
Oh boy. I don't watch any of those shows. So I'm going to say a club.
Okay, awesome. What is your favorite quote or phrase in the business world?
Wow. No idea. So I'm going to go with a standby. It is what it is.
But that's actually one of the most true quotes there is, because it's like, there's no negative, there's no positive. It just is. It is what it is.
Yeah.
What is one of the top business books you would recommend?
You know what? I don't really read business books. And I will tell you, there is a book on self-directed IRAs, since we're on that topic of self-directed IRAs, written by an author by the name of Matt Sorensen.
Okay.
And it's a very good book. He's a tax attorney, I believe. But anyway, you can get that on Amazon. And for people who are thinking about self-direction, that's a very good initial inroad to the self-directed world by getting that book.
What is your favorite movie?
Gosh, if you ask my spouse, it would be like, there's like 200. I'm just going to go with something real quick. I'm going to say something like The Fugitive or In the Line of Fire with Clint Eastwood. There's so many good movies out there.
The Fugitive is actually really good, and I have not watched that in ages, and I'm putting that back on my movie list because I have not really enjoyed the new movies, and I love those old school 90s like action thriller flicks. So
here's another one for your listeners. I always used to make fun of people who watch TCM, Turner Classic Movies. And now I don't want to say I'm a diehard fan, but there's a really cute Christmas. It came out in the middle of summer when it was first released, like back in the 40s. But it's a Miracle on Fifth Avenue. And it's about a homeless guy who moves into the home of a rich guy who leaves every winter and goes down south. And he ends up bringing in some other people who are homeless. And they just have a really special time around the holidays talking about what's most important in life. And they're very happy because they're living in a mansion and they're cooking food and sharing time and love together. And so it's just a cute movie.
That's awesome. Great one. If you are a small business owner, you're doing $10 million in sales on an annual basis, and I walk through the front door and I hand you a $300,000 check, what would you advise that business owner do with that $300,000, an investment to 2x their revenue over the next year or two?
Now, Jared, I'm not a financial planner and I don't sell investments.
Okay. It's okay. You don't have to be. You could say invested in personal coaching.
But I personally like real estate. I've always bought into the philosophy that dirt doesn't move. And as the
Ooh.
world gets more populated, there's just less dirt to go around. But if you own some of that dirt, you own it.
I
That's not
love
wrong.
the quote, "Dirt doesn't move." I'm going to have to add that to my repertoire. Why it's a really good investment. Dirt can be moved, but it doesn't move itself. So that's
Yes,
actually
dirt can be moved. Yes.
that's actually really good. Okay, last question, and I perceive this to be one of the most important questions, is what is the biggest obstacle that you have ever had to overcome in your business to reach the success that you have today?
Biggest, really pretty straightforward is just getting started because as we know, most businesses fail. So I think in my case with PGI, just when I started the business back in 2007 or 2008, can't remember which year it was, but it's just being able to stay in the business long enough until you develop a reputation and a name where you start gravitating business towards you based on
Mm,
clients you've already worked with, so referrals and those kind of things. But I think just that initial probably 6 month period where it's like I really enjoyed this business, but I'm doing it on my own.
mm,
Am I going to be able to stay in this thing?
mm.
Early on, that was probably the biggest struggle.
Well, you've made it and you started and you're thriving. So, John Park, thank you so much for being on 0 to 100 today.
Jared, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to 0 to 100 podcast. We hope you feel inspired and ready to accelerate your business. Remember, your journey to success starts with a single step. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving for greatness. For more resources and show notes, visit jaredguyrandolph.com. We'll see you next time.